Steam controller is officially coming back. But there's a catch. This is Valve's Steam controller. It came out almost a decade ago, and it was known for being a massive flop. But for the past few weeks, I've been playing exclusively with one. And I've realized that after thousands of hours playing with every controller imaginable, 9 years ago, it might not have been understood. But today that picture is completely different. Controllers are a complicated subject. And back in 2015, as a new teenager, I never even really considered getting one of these, and it was kind of a nightmare product for Valve. They tried to innovate with a gamepad that could bridge the gap between PC and console gaming for their Steam machines, using trackpads and universally mapped controls. Sales were abysmal, a lot of people found it too complicated, Scuff ended up suing them for patent infringement on the back paddles, and just 4 years later, Valve shut the whole thing down and had a $5 fire sale for the remaining inventory. Now today, you can buy one of these on eBay for 70 bucks. Of course, never having experienced one and only using a Steam Deck, I really wanted to see how far the experience has come all these years later. Because back then, I remember watching the reviews when this dropped, and they were pretty negative. I didn't want to spend $50 on something that was apparently worse than an Xbox controller. So I've taken the past 2 weeks to really learn this controller and put it through its paces in a variety of different testing scenarios and games against the best we have today. FPS games are really the bread and butter of a good quality mouse and keyboard setup, and without any auto aim assistance, controllers are just getting beat out here. Now, fighting games and platformers can have added comfort with a controller and even the edge over mouse and keyboard. So what we're gonna do is test my experience, which is totally subjective, with a Steam controller against all of these. And the results were really interesting. Starting with FPS games, I'm not an aim god by any means, but I do play them once in a while. The first test was Aim Labs with the good old G Pro Superlight. It felt very smooth. You have ultimate control over the raw input with a mouse, relying mostly on flicking and stopping power. My average score was 151,000, which placed it within the top 50 on Aim Labs. And I knew trying to beat this with a gamepad without auto aim was going to be nearly impossible for me. Of course, this would be my preferred aiming setup with a handheld, but of course, unless you're in a dock setup, it's not really possible. So you have to rely on gamepads, which are ultimately limited by joysticks. So next up were the gamepads. I tested an Xbox controller and immediately felt less precision and accuracy. Like most modern game developers design games with the controller in mind as the primary input method. And after so many years, game devs have figured out ways to make this experience as smooth as possible with bullet magnetism, optimized hitboxes, aim assist settings. It became very clear to me that regardless of how pro a controller is, it's still a controller. The tolerances on the sticks and the height differences maybe do make a difference, but it's still a controller. But a mouse still smoked any of my joystick scores. Platformers and indie games were a completely different story, which I'm used to playing with a controller. You have a clear edge with an analog input where you can just gradually control your movement rather than a flat out button press like a keyboard. Hall effect keyboards like the Wooting have begun to flood the market for competitive esports, which no doubt offers you an advantage. We've already seen Valve has banned some of these movement inputs in some of their games. Of course, handhelds are not the optimal place to play competitive esports games, and you'll probably be at your desk, which leads me to talk about FlexiSpot, who sponsored this video and funds all these old controller testing experiments. Their E7 Pro has become a staple of my setup, whether you want a completely height adjustable desk, which is actually not a bad idea considering a lot of us sit for far too long during the day. The motors are whisper quiet. There's a touchpad with macro controls that keeps all your settings saved. It also happens to be an essentially bomb-proof construction. It holds up to 440 pounds. It's made from carbon steel, so there's no swaying or moving around even at the taller heights. And they offer a bunch of different tabletops to choose from, so you can get exactly what you're looking for at a pretty reasonable price. You can also actually organize your cables with their rack attachments, so I'll have everything linked in the description down below if you're interested. Now moving on, initial testing shows us probably what we already know. The mouse for shooters or PC games that are built with the mouse input at the forefront, and the controllers for handheld devices, story games, platforms, and that comfortable laid-back couch experience. But here's the thing I wanted to find out. What if you could get really good at using the Steam controller's hybrid features like the trackpads? Can you find a happy middle ground between both inputs like Valve promised all these years ago? So back to Aim Labs. First goal, beat the joysticks and see how close we can come to the mouse. That was the idea until I played my first game and realized how kind of horrible it is to use a trackpad as an input device. If you've ever used a laptop trackpad for aiming, it kind of feels like that. Precision and tracking is all over the place, and the pads themselves don't offer a ton of room for your thumbs. So if I would have just played one game, I would tell you, this is terrible, I get why it's failed, just throw it out. Until I kept trying different methods, and I found something completely underrated that I haven't really seen much. Gyro aiming, which within itself is not a new concept, but when I started to tweak the sensitivity curve, I started to notice my score gradually going up. I was getting more comfortable, but it wasn't perfect by any means because motion controls are a bit exhausting, having to whip the controller around to flick. After a bit of research, I found some recommended settings by some gyro players that are using this flick stick method. This style of aiming essentially can use both the trackpads and sticks at a higher sensitivity for flicking and then combines the gyro for precise adjustment. And what this translates to is a bit more like a mouse feel rather than a joystick. And with this method, I was actually able to surpass my controller scores. With enough time getting used to it, I ended up, funny enough, right between the controller and the mouse on the leaderboard. So here's the thing. I understand this controller now, and I get why it failed. The crippling factor of only having one joystick was really rough, but you have to respect the ambition to drive the industry further that Valve did with the Steam controller. I'll tell you that typing prompts are legitimately a perfect experience on trackpads. You're not beating this with a traditional controller. And what made this so special was its versatility. It paved the road for the Steam Deck and the Steam Input API, which allows all controllers the open gate to PC compatibility nowadays. The dual stage nature of the trigger lets you aim and fire from the same button, so you can simulate just about any control scheme like a D-pad. There's haptic feedback, so you can emulate the analog sticks, control wheels, but at the same time, it just wasn't for the casual gamer out there. PC gaming can often require a ton of tinkering and customization, which is great, but at the same time, it's not gonna attract the average person out there who doesn't change any settings, let alone the default controls. Valve needed to create a controller that would cover the full library of Steam games, and before the Steam Deck, this is what they came up with. You can see all the lessons they learned with the Steam controller today. And just because this failed as a product doesn't mean it didn't innovate the modern gamepad. It's not the most quality feeling controller, quite the opposite actually. The bumpers are stiff, the trackpads are not great, the buttons are mushy. But when you combine all of the Steam controller's strengths with a modern game controller, you get one of those input versatile experiences out there. There is no such thing as the perfect device for everyone. You might hate motion controls, which I totally understand, but regardless, this thing was a boundary breaker. Would I tell you to go run out and pick one of these up today? Probably not for most people. But I think a lot of us would be very interested in seeing a second generation Steam controller from Valve and see where we go from there, because what we have right now is kind of just okay. So big thanks for watching. I'll have links to everything in the description down below, including Flexi Spot's Black Friday sale if you want to check that out. So big thanks for watching once again, and I'll see you guys in the next one.